Hey, Soul Stories fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now stay with us. The story begins. The glass door of Hamilton and Lowe closed behind Avery with a soft, refined click. The kind of cold, polished sound that made it feel as though the building had been designed to swallow every emotion whole, then return people in a neat, sterilized version of themselves. The scent of expensive leather and dark roasted coffee lingered in the air. On the walls hung gold-framed diplomas, photographs of handshakes and contract signings, plaques engraved with partners' names. A gallery of power rather than a place meant to handle something as human as an ending. Avery stood at the reception desk for a few seconds, her hands clasped together on the strap of her bag. She had practiced this posture all week. No hunched shoulders, no lowered head, no letting her eyes reveal anything beyond "I'm fine." She wore a light beige, straight-cut coat that fell to her knees. At a glance, it made her look as though she had simply lost some weight, or maybe just eaten a large meal. Underneath was a simple dress, soft fabric, loose enough that when she sat down, everything would still look normal. Avery knew her 5-month body well enough to understand which angles could hide it and which would expose it completely. She hadn't come here to put on a performance, but she wasn't foolish enough to offer her secret to that room before she was ready. She said her name. The receptionist didn't look up right away. Nude polished fingers continued tapping on the keyboard, as if Avery were just another appointment on the schedule. Not a woman who had come to sign the final punctuation mark on a marriage. An internal phone line buzzed softly. The receptionist picked up the receiver, smiling with practiced ease. "Conference room 3, hallway on the right, second door. Mr. Kensington is already here." Avery nodded. "Thank you." She walked on, the sound of her heels striking the polished stone floor in an even rhythm. Each step was a reminder. Don't shake. Don't beg. Don't turn back. All she needed to do today was sign and leave. The hallway was long, brightly lit, and cold. The framed degrees along the wall reflected the ceiling lights into white streaks. Avery caught her own reflection in the glass. A woman with her hair pulled into a low bun, a nearly bare face, eyes so calm they might be mistaken for empty. But Avery wasn't empty. She had simply learned how to store her emotions where no one could see them. At the door to the conference room, she took a deep breath. One breath her chest had to share with another rhythm, smaller and more secret, hidden beneath layers of fabric. Then she pushed the door open. The light hit her first, then the long, dark wooden table, polished smooth as still water. And at the far end, like a position designed so its occupant would always be the center of gravity, Damien Kensington. He didn't stand. Damien wore a charcoal suit with a crisp white collar, hair neatly styled, jawline sharp, gray eyes like polished stone. On either side of him sat 2 attorneys, one man, one woman, both wearing the same expression. This is a case, not a tragedy. Avery felt Damien's gaze sweep over her quickly, clinically. Coat, hair, face, posture. He looked at her the way he would look at a report, searching for discrepancies. Perhaps he had been expecting a different Avery, an Avery with dark circles under her eyes, an Avery who would collapse into the chair the moment she saw him, an Avery who would tremble and say, "I'm sorry," the way she used to, even when the fault was never hers. But today, Avery simply walked forward, pulled out a chair, and sat down. When she sat, the straight-cut coat fell smoothly like a curtain. The edge of the table concealed her lower abdomen. She placed her bag on her lap out of habit. Everything looked tidy. Helena Moore, her attorney, sat across from her and gave Avery a small nod. Helena's eyes said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Damien spoke first, his voice smooth as fresh paper. "Thank you for coming. Let's do this quickly. No need to drag it out." Avery met his gaze. "I want it done quickly, too." The word quickly didn't mean the same thing when it came from her mouth as it did from his. For Damien, it was a command. For Avery, it was an ending. Damien's lawyer began reviewing the terms. Assets, the apartment, the car, accounts. The numbers passed through Avery's ears like the hum of an air conditioner. She had read everything. She had initial drafts. She was prepared. Damien was generous enough that an outsider might mistake him for a decent man. He was leaving her enough to live on, not out of kindness, but because he wanted everything wrapped up before his wedding to Sloane. Damien always liked to scrub away the stains before stepping onto a stage. Avery listened as an attorney spoke about entitlements, agreements, and waivers of claims. Damien leaned back in his chair, fingers laced across his chest, looking as though he were waiting to close a business deal, not a divorce. Then, in the middle of a long explanation, Damien suddenly interrupted, as if he'd grown bored with the game. He looked at Avery, longer than necessary. "You look different." Avery didn't move. "Different how?" Helena asked, her voice dry. Damien didn't answer Helena. He kept staring at Avery, as if she were a puzzle that irritated him. "You look better, clearer." One corner of his mouth lifted, a smile that had once made Avery believe it was gentle, only to later realize it was merely another form of control. "Seeing someone new?" A beat of silence settled over the room. Avery felt her heart pound, not because of the question, but because of the authority Damien still believed he had, the right to interrogate her as if she still belonged to him. She lifted her eyes, calm enough to surprise even herself. "That's no longer any of your concern." A flicker of darkness passed through Damien's eyes. For a brief moment, he looked like a man who had just been denied his right to give orders. But he scoffed lightly, as if Avery were being childish. "Fine," he gestured to the lawyer. "Continue." The paperwork was pushed across the table, a thick file held together with a gleaming metal clip. Damien slid the folder toward Avery, his fingertip tapping the tabletop with a soft knock. Not loud, but enough to remind Avery that this was a man who had once been able to silence an entire room with a single gesture. Damien said clearly, coldly, "Sign it, and be done." Helena placed a pen in front of Avery. "Just sign here and here." Avery took a breath. She leaned forward slightly to reach for it, and at that exact moment, a small sound rang out. Click. A pen, not Avery's, slipped from someone's hand on Damien's side of the table. Perhaps Damien had tapped too hard and sent it rolling, or perhaps his attorney had brushed it by accident. Either way, the pen hit the floor and rolled beneath the table, skittering away as if determined to stretch the moment. A small detail, but on certain days it's precisely the smallest details that open the biggest doors. Damien frowned. Annoying. His lawyer bent down to retrieve it, but the pen had already rolled to Avery's side. Avery looked at it, then pushed her chair back and stood. And this was the moment her body betrayed every careful plan. The left side of her coat caught on the edge of the chair, on a small hook, or the armrest, or simply a corner that was too sharp. Avery didn't realize it immediately. She took half a step forward and bent down. The coat jerked back. The snap buttons came undone. Instinctively, Avery twisted sideways to free herself, and the curve of 5 months was suddenly, unmistakably visible beneath the conference room lights. Round, firm, a life growing. Not a big meal, not weight gain. Avery still bent down and picked up the pen. Her fingers closed around the cold metal on the floor, as if it were just an ordinary object. But above the table, the air had already changed. She heard Damien's chair scrape back hard. Screech! Avery looked up. Damien was staring at her as if she did not exist in the world he controlled. His gray eyes widened. 1 second. 2. As if he didn't know where to place this reality within his internal system of right and wrong. And then the pen in his hand dropped onto the table. Click. This time the sound was louder, like a stamp coming down. Damien could no longer keep his smooth tone. From his throat came a short, fractured sentence, raw with disbelief. "What is that?" Avery straightened, still holding the pen she'd picked up. Her coat remained lightly caught on the chair, pulled aside as if on purpose. She looked at Damien. No panic, no tears. Just calm. And it was precisely that calm that made it terrifying. Damien shot to his feet so fast the leather chair behind him slammed back with a dry crack, its legs scraping hard across the polished wood floor like claw marks. Impossible. His voice came out rough, as if he couldn't believe his own ears. "We've tried for years." In that moment, everything else in the conference room became meaningless. Every gaze locked onto a single point. Avery's stomach. The two lawyers beside Damien glanced at each other, confused. They had no idea how a smooth signing had suddenly turned into an explosion. Helena Moore said nothing right away. She simply sat there, both hands resting on the tabletop, like someone who had foreseen this scene a long time ago. Avery was still standing, holding the pen she had just picked up. The hem of her blazer caught on the chair, like an accidental hook, revealing her secret under the ceiling lights. Damien stared at her, eyes wide as if searching for some reason to turn what he was seeing into a visual mistake. "What is that?" he repeated, this time lower, more dangerous. "Talk!" Avery took a breath, then calmly pulled the blazer free from the chair. No rush, no panic. She unbuttoned it as if shedding a final layer of armor. The fabric fell onto the chair. The room went silent. Avery placed one hand on her stomach, exactly where her body instinctively chose. A protective reflex, not a performance. Something a mother does before the woman has time to think. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "I'm pregnant, 5 months." The silence stretched unnaturally long. Damien blinked, then let out a very short laugh. Not out of amusement, but because his brain was desperately looking for an escape route. "No," he said, almost grinding the word out. "That's not possible." Avery met his gaze. "It is." Damien stepped toward the table, both palms slamming down on the dark wood. A vein pulsed at his temple. He looked at her stomach like it had betrayed him. "We've tried for years," he repeated louder this time. "So many doctors, so many tests." "We," Avery echoed mildly. "You call that we?" There was no exclamation point in the question, but it cut like a thin blade. Damien didn't answer. He pivoted, fast, instinctive. "Who's the father?" The room seemed to stop breathing. One of Damien's lawyers leaned forward slightly, as if about to intervene, then stopped, because this was no longer about clauses. This was something no wording could fix. Avery didn't dodge it. She stood straight, shoulders steady, eyes unwavering. "You are." The words dropped onto the table like a stone. Damien froze. 1 second. 2. Then his face shifted, from white to red, then back to white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. "No," he whispered, as if to himself. "It can't be me. If it were me, then—" "If it were you, you wouldn't be sitting here," Avery cut in, still calm. "You wouldn't have slid divorce papers across the table like you were discarding a defective product." Damien flinched as if slapped. Avery kept her hand on her stomach. It didn't tremble, but inside her, an old memory flared. One night when everything had collapsed. A snowy night. In her memory, the penthouse windows reflected the city lights like gleaming blades. Snow fell outside, white and cold, but inside the living room, it was colder. Avery sat on the sofa, laptop open, the screen filled with lists of doctors, clinics, and treatments. She had found another specialist. She had taken notes. She had hoped, even as that hope began to feel more and more like a bruise. Damien walked in, bringing with him the scent of alcohol and expensive perfume. He tossed his coat onto a chair like it meant nothing. He poured himself a drink, took a long swallow, then looked at Avery the way one looks at a machine that doesn't work. "Enough," he said. "I'm tired of this." Avery looked up, trying to keep her voice gentle. "We can try one more." "Try more?" Damien gave a humorless laugh. "How many more hospitals do you want to drag me to?" "I just—" He cut her off, his voice ice cold. "Do you know what drives me insane? You're always hoping, like your hope is something I'm obligated to endure." Avery stood, her eyes red but refusing to cry. "I'm not trying to make you suffer. I just want—" "Want what?" Damien set his glass down so hard the liquor sloshed. He stepped closer, leaning in, his gaze sharp as a blade. "You're defective, Avery." The words fell lightly and crushed her. Avery felt as if she'd been torn out of her own skin. Damien went on, his tone growing more bitter by the second. "You're useless. What's the point of a wife who can't give me a child?" Avery froze. She opened her mouth, but her throat closed. Damien turned away, his voice casual, as if discussing a contract. "I need a more suitable wife. Someone who doesn't embarrass me." Yeah. Then almost as an afterthought, he added one more sentence, one that made the room unbreathable. Sloan won't make me live in this hell. The memory snapped off like a light being extinguished. Avery was back in the conference room, under cold white lighting. Damien was still standing there, still handsome, still perfectly put together. But in Avery's eyes, he was just the man who had once called her defective. Damien looked at her, his lips moving. When? Avery answered, concise as a line in a case file. Before you moved out. Before you started parading Sloan everywhere like a trophy. Damien blinked rapidly. He stumbled back a step as if shoved. Then suddenly he changed tactics. The voice of a man accustomed to control, now desperately trying to reclaim it. Then let's not get divorced. Damien's lawyer immediately looked up, about to speak. Helena leaned forward slightly, ready to block him. But Damien wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Avery. We can start over, he said quickly, as if convincing himself. For the baby, you can't break up a family when... Family, Avery repeated. There was no warmth in her smile. You call what we had a family? Damien clenched his jaw. Avery, listen to me. This changes everything. No, Avery said. It only changes you. Because now you finally have what you want. But I don't want you anymore. Helena set the file down on the table, her voice firm. We will proceed according to the legal process. Her pregnancy does not automatically invalidate the agreement. Everything will be handled in writing. Damien whipped around to Helena, his eyes dark. Shut up! Helena didn't blink. You don't give me orders. Damien turned back to Avery, his breathing sharper now. Part of him was likely panicking over loss. Another part was furious at losing control. What are you planning to do? He snarled. Take my child away? Change their last name? Turn me into an outsider? Avery met his stare without flinching. I plan to raise my child somewhere. No one calls their mother defective. Damien stiffened. He opened his mouth and the words came out before he could stop them. The truest thing about him. I'll take the child. The air in the conference room turned colder, as if the AC had suddenly been cranked up. Avery didn't step back. She didn't cry. She looked at Damien the way one looks at a stranger who once carried the title husband. Her voice was low, clear, and cold enough for everyone in the room to hear. Try. The phone vibrated on the tabletop like something small yet heavy. Avery was standing in the old apartment, the place that had once been home, by Damien's definition. Spotless, expensive, leaving no trace that a real woman had ever lived there. A few cardboard boxes sat on the floor. A blanket lay folded hastily over a chair. The room echoed with the hollowness of an ending. Avery looked at the screen. A message from Helena Moore. He signed, "You're Avery Carter again." Just one sentence. But it felt as though someone had quietly removed a metal cuff from her wrist. No noise, no spectacle. Just a sudden lightness so abrupt that Avery had to brace herself against the edge of the table to stay upright. Avery Carter. That name had belonged to her before she became Mrs. Kensington on business cards, invitations, and society pages. It had once been a name that smelled of sunlight, with smears of paint on her hands, with dreams that didn't require anyone's permission. She didn't cry. The tears didn't come. She simply closed her eyes for a second and exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for far too long. Then she lifted the phone and texted Helena back. Thank you. 2 words were enough. Some things require no more than survival to be fully said. Avery's new apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building that was just clean enough, just noisy enough in an ordinary, everyday way. There was no marble lobby, no security guard calling her Mrs. and bowing as if he were acknowledging a ring. Just creaking wooden stairs, a hallway that smelled of soap, and now and then, burnt butter from someone else's kitchen. The door opened onto a space much smaller than the penthouse, but strangely, Avery stepped inside and didn't feel cramped. She felt light. Outside the window was a shared courtyard. Children ran in circles around an old swing set, their laughter bursting into beads of sound in the afternoon sun. An elderly woman walked her dog past, stopping to chat with a neighbor as if they'd known each other forever. Someone called out a name from a balcony, the kind of calling that didn't bother with politeness. Avery stood there for a few seconds, watching, then noticed something very small and very strange. Her shoulders were no longer hunched. She set the boxes down, took off her shoes, and walked barefoot across the wooden floor. It wasn't mirror polished, but it was warm, and it was real. The next day, she went to the administrative office to finalize the lease paperwork. The clerk asked for her name. Avery said it clearly, without stumbling. Avery Carter. The clerk typed, then read it back. Carter. All right. That was it. No one asked why. No one looked at her as if measuring who she belonged to. The surname returned to her so normally that Avery had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. A milestone of dignity doesn't always need a stage. Sometimes it only needs the right line of text. That evening, Avery opened her bag and took out her new ID. The word printed on it made her heart tremble like a small bell. Carter. She placed the card on the table and looked at it as if it were a promise. Her new rhythm of life began with small things. In the mornings, Avery walked around the neighborhood. The streets weren't as pristine as the upscale area Damien had chosen, but there were trees, the smell of pastries from a corner bakery, a coffee shop where the barista remembered customers with a smile. Avery bought a cup of hot tea, sat outside, watched people live, and realized that she too was living. She signed up for a prenatal yoga class at the community center. The first time she walked in, she expected to feel awkward. Instead, she found other women. Big bellies, small bellies, t-shirts, hastily tied hair, real laughter. No one looked at Avery like a scandal. No one looked at her as someone's wife, just a woman about to become a mother. Avery learned how to breathe deeply, how to relax her back, how to listen to her body instead of forcing it to fit someone else's expectations. And between those breaths, sometimes she felt a gentle movement in her belly, a soft but certain reminder that a life was there with her. About 4 months to go. 4 months sounded both long and short, but for the first time, Avery saw the future no longer as a black wall. She began preparing a small corner of the bedroom, a second-hand foldable crib, a few neutral-colored newborn outfits, and a soft blanket. Nothing extravagant, but every item she set down was a quiet sentence. This is your home. Damien didn't leave her alone right away. Her phone vibrated constantly in those first days. Calls from his number, sometimes from unknown ones, sometimes messages that swung back and forth between, "I'm sorry," and "We need to talk." Avery didn't respond. She forwarded everything to Helena. Then the flowers started arriving. Expensive bouquets elaborately arranged, wrapped in glossy paper like apologies purchased with money. The delivery person rang the bell and asked, "Avery, Kensington." Avery would simply say, "Carter," and sign with a neat stroke of her name. She didn't throw the flowers away. She didn't keep them either. Downstairs lived an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Elaine, a gray-haired woman who often sat in the courtyard with a knitted shawl and a book. Avery carried the bouquet down and placed it on the bench beside her. "For you." Mrs. Elaine looked up, first at the flowers as if they were a miracle, then at Avery. "Why are you giving them to me?" Avery shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I don't need them." Mrs. Elaine smiled, lifted one flower to smell it. "Sometimes people give flowers not to make us happy, but to make themselves feel less guilty." Avery said nothing. Mrs. Elaine didn't ask anything else. She simply handed Avery a peppermint candy, as if it were a fair exchange. Avery took the candy, and for the first time in many days, felt a small warmth in her chest. That night, Avery was heating a glass of warm milk in the kitchen when the building buzzer rang. The sound came suddenly, making her flinch. She wiped her hands, walked to the door, and looked at the camera screen mounted inside. The image appeared under the dim yellow light of the lobby, Damien Kensington. He stood there as if he still had the right to stand there. Dark coat, straight posture, expressionless face, but his eyes, those gray eyes, no longer held the smooth confidence of the boardroom. There was something else in them, hot, tense, and dangerous in a way Avery knew all too well. Avery stood still, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The buzzer rang again. She stared at the screen, at the man downstairs, and in the space between them, Avery heard her own heartbeat clearly. like a knock on a door. The building buzzer rang for the third time. Avery stood behind her apartment door, one hand resting on her belly, a reflex that was both protective and self-soothing. On the camera screen, Damien was still there, standing straight, silent, like a breathing stone. He looked directly toward the lens as if trying to pierce through the thin layer of plastic to see straight at her. Avery swallowed. Her throat was dry as though she had just crossed a desert. She pressed the intercom button. Her voice came out calm, so calm it surprised even her. Everything goes through the lawyers. No extra words, no why are you here? No, go away. And no, please, just a boundary. Avery shut off the intercom immediately. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't give Damien a chance to turn a sentence into a negotiation. She stood still for a few seconds, watching the screen. Damien remained there for a moment longer, then finally turned and walked away. His figure disappeared from the frame like a storm forced to stop at the threshold. Avery exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath for far too long, and then, in the quiet that followed, she felt her belly. Not hunger, but a gentle movement. A small tap from the inside, like a reminder. "Mom, I'm here." Avery placed her hand there softly. "I'm okay," she whispered, not sure who she was speaking to her baby or to herself. The next morning, Avery went to the clinic. Not the large hospital Damien used to take her to, the way one delivers a broken object to a repair shop. Not the cold hallways, not the sharp click of hurried shoes, not the looks that treated her like a high-risk case. This clinic was smaller, warmer. The glass door was decorated with clouds and a little deer. The waiting area smelled of herbal tea, and there was a shelf of children's books, old ones, worn spines, as if they had passed through many imperfect hands. Avery stepped inside and felt as though she were entering a place that didn't demand proof of anything from her. She filled out the paperwork. In the full name box, she wrote clearly, Avery Carter. When she handed the form to the receptionist, the young woman read it and smiled kindly. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. How are you feeling today?" Just a simple question, but Avery paused for half a beat because it had been a long time since anyone had asked her how she felt without attaching a list of expectations. She answered briefly, "I'm fine." The receptionist nodded and entered the information into the computer. "Your file notes a previous last name, Kensington. How would you like us to address you?" Avery didn't hesitate. "Miss Carter." She said it this time not as a defiant statement, but as something self-evident. Her name belonged to her. "Yes, Miss Carter," the receptionist replied immediately without further questions. "Please have a seat. The nurse will call you shortly." Avery chose a chair near the window. Morning sunlight fell across the floor in a warm stripe. Outside, a maple tree rustled, its leaves trembling as if talking to the wind. Avery watched, and for a few minutes, the tightness in her chest eased. She didn't know how long she had lived in rooms where the only sound was her own heart beating with anxiety. The nurse's voice called out, "Miss Carter?" And Avery followed her down a short hallway lined with watercolor paintings, childlike drawings of families, of dogs and cats, of sons with smiling faces. Imperfect, but full of life. The nurse took her blood pressure, weight, and asked basic questions. Avery answered concisely, "Dr. Rivera will see you shortly." The name passed through Avery's mind like something unfamiliar but pleasant. Rivera. She sat on the exam table, hands resting on her thighs like a student waiting for a test. The door opened, and Dr. Mateo Rivera walked in. He was in his mid-30s, tall enough to make the room feel slightly smaller, but without any sense of pressure. A white lab coat hung loosely over a light-colored shirt, sleeves rolled up neatly. His dark hair was slightly wavy, with a few strands refusing to stay in place, as if he'd just hurried from one room to another. But what caught Avery's attention most was his eyes. They were deep brown, and they didn't look at her like a file. They looked at her like a person. Mateo smiled, his voice warm, not overly familiar, but enough to soften the room. "Hello, Miss Carter. I'm Mateo Rivera. How are you and the baby today?" Avery blinked slightly. For the first time in a question, she heard her mention first, and then the baby. She replied, "I'm fine. The baby on it is fine too." Mateo nodded, opened his tablet, and skimmed the information. 5 months. Based on the previous notes, it seems like the baby is quite active. Avery found herself smiling faintly, a very small smile, as if her lips had forgotten how to curve. Sometimes I think the baby is practicing soccer. Mateo laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. I like babies with athletic ambitions. He proceeded with the exam, checking the heartbeat, measuring, and asking about sleep and nutrition. But the way he worked never made Avery feel like she was being measured. Every time he placed the device against her belly, he warned her first. Every question came with a pause, as if he were giving her time to be a human being, not just an answer. When the baby's heartbeat filled the room, fast, clear, steady, Avery felt her eyes grow warm. She quickly looked away. Mateo didn't comment. He simply lowered his voice like someone who understood that some moments didn't need words. When he finished, he removed his gloves, washed his hands, then pulled up a chair and sat near Avery. Not too close to invade her space, but close enough to speak like two adults. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "may I ask a question that's a bit outside my specialty?" Avery looked at him. Inside her, a barrier rose automatically. In the past, outside questions often led to judgment and advice like, "You should try harder." She nodded slightly. "It depends." Mateo glanced at the tablet, then back at her. "There are two last names on your file, and I noticed you came alone." He paused, choosing his words. Then he asked, without circling, without cheap curiosity, without implication, "Are you safe?" Those four words made the room go quiet inside Avery's head. She felt as if someone had touched a bruise she had carefully hidden beneath loose coats, beneath the answers, "I'm fine," beneath the name Carter she had just reclaimed. Avery opened her mouth, then closed it. Her throat tightened, blocked by something invisible. Safe. That word in her life had become conditional. Safe if she obeyed. Safe if she didn't embarrass Damien. Safe if she didn't upset him. But here the question had no conditions. Mateo looked at her without pushing. His eyes were patient, as if he were prepared to sit there all day just to let her know she had the right to be silent. Avery inhaled, exhaled. "I am safe," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I just got divorced." Mateo didn't look shocked. He simply nodded slowly, receiving it as a fact, not gossip. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'm sorry you had to go through that while pregnant." Avery gave a dry, humorless smile. "I don't want more questions." "I understand," Mateo said. "I don't need details." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, steadier. "I just need you to know this. If anyone ever makes you feel threatened, pressured, or if you need support, tell me. We have resources, and I don't want you carrying everything on your own." Avery looked at him, her heart beating faster. Part of her wanted the familiar reflex. "It's fine, I can handle it," because that was how she had survived. But another part, the tired part, just wanted to set the weight down. She couldn't say thank you right away. She only nodded. Mateo studied her for a moment longer. His gaze didn't promise romance, didn't play the hero. He was simply a grown man standing exactly where he needed to stand, on the right side of what was right. He said slowly, clearly, like laying a foundation, "If you need someone on your side, I can be that person." Avery felt something inside her tremble, like a string touched after a long silence. She lowered her head, looking at her hand resting on her belly. A gentle movement from within answered, as if the baby had heard too. And for the first time in a very long while, Avery walked out of the clinic with a strange new feeling. Not rescued, but seen. The corner cafe had a name so charming it always made Avery smile a little. Morning Cedar. A dark wooden sign, white hand-painted letters, and a green plant hanging by the glass door like cascading hair. Inside it smelled of espresso and cinnamon. No one here knew she had once lived in a penthouse. No one called her Mrs. Kensington. Here Avery was just a pregnant woman who liked sitting by the window, ordering hot tea and watching life pass by. She chose a table right against the glass so the sunlight could fall across her hands. On the table lay a small notebook Helena had given her, a kind of strategy notebook, a to-do list, emergency numbers, a few notes about legal boundaries. Avery had just taken a sip of tea when her phone vibrated, a reminder from her prenatal yoga class for next week. A new life was trying to grow out of old ashes. She had just set her phone down when a shadow fell across her table. The perfume arrived first, sharp and cold, like metal coated in sugar. A female voice sounded directly above her, soft but barbed. "You're the ex-wife?" Avery looked up. The woman standing there was tall and slim, with perfectly styled blonde waves and a light-colored coat that looked straight out of a magazine. Everything about her was right. The right brand, the right cut, the right look of someone who knows she's being looked at. Those blue eyes weren't curious. They were calculating, measuring Avery's position in her personal hierarchy. Avery didn't need an introduction. She had seen Sloane's face in the carefully leaked society pieces Damien allowed. Those accidental investor dinners, half-face photos at events, the way the media called her a rising star in marketing. Sloane Hart. Avery rested her hand on the mug handle, steadying her breath. "What do you want?" Sloane tilted her head, as if deciding whether Avery was worth her time. Then she pulled out the chair across from Avery and sat down without asking. A small act, but enough for Avery to understand. She was here to take space. "Damien says you're very reasonable," Sloane began, her smile thin. "So I thought we could talk like adults." Avery didn't smile back. "I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, you have plenty." Sloane's gaze flicked briefly, quickly but venomously, toward Avery's stomach. "I hear you're pregnant." Avery's fingers tightened slightly around the mug. Sloane leaned back, meeting her eyes. "I'll admit, this move, it's quite clever." Avery blinked. "What move?" "The trap," Sloane said, as if it were the most ordinary word in the world. "Getting pregnant right when the divorce is happening, like an undo button to pull Damien back." Avery looked at her, and in that moment she saw something clearly. Sloane's confidence didn't come from love. It came from believing she was the winner of life's beauty contest. Avery set the mug down gently. "I didn't trap anyone." Sloane smirked. "You say that because you know you can't beat me." She leaned in slightly, her voice lower, sharper. "Our wedding is next month. Damien needs a stable life, a clean image. You understand that, right?" Avery didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window where sunlight fell on a bicycle passing by. Someone laughed at the counter. That ordinary noise anchored her to the ground. She turned back, her voice calm. "What do you want me to do?" Sloane smiled as if Avery had finally found her mark. "Be sensible. Don't make noise. Don't—" Her eyes flicked again to Avery's stomach. "Don't turn this into an excuse to make demands." Avery leaned back slightly, keeping her distance. "I'm not competing." Sloane raised an eyebrow. Avery continued, slow and clear. "I'm just leaving." There was no challenge in the words. They landed like a simple fact. Sloane paused, just a fraction of a beat. Perhaps she had prepared for an Avery who begged, or an Avery who raged. But Avery had chosen the most uncomfortable option for control-driven people. Not playing. Sloane smiled again, but this time it wasn't gentle. "You think leaving is the end of it? You have a child. Damien won't let you decide everything on your own." Avery met her gaze. Her eyes weren't as sharp as Sloane's. They were darker, deeper. The eyes of someone who had once been pushed under and learned how to breathe underwater. "That's between me and Damien and me, not between me and you." Sloane tilted her head slightly, her smile icy. "You say that because you don't understand how his world works. Damien belongs to things bigger than you think. He needs the right woman." Avery nodded faintly, almost like agreement, then said something that made Sloane freeze. "Good luck with being right." Sloane looked at Avery as if she'd just been placed beneath her, and she wasn't used to that. Her fingernails tapped lightly against the tabletop in irritation. "Don't pretend you're above this," Sloane said. "I know women like you. You want him to see your belly and come back. You want to ruin my wedding." Avery stood up. No rush, no scene. She slung her bag over her shoulder and placed a bill on the table for her tea. "You just described your fear," Avery replied lightly. "Not my truth." Sloane stood too, trying to block her path. If you had any self-respect, Avery looked her straight in the eyes. Self-respect is why I left. She stepped around Sloane and walked toward the door. The small wind chime hanging there rang softly as she pushed the glass open. Cold air hit her face, snapping her fully awake. She walked a block before realizing her hands were shaking. Not from fear of Sloane, from something older, a memory of being judged, compared, reduced to not enough. Sloane was just a polished mirror reflecting the wound Damien had left behind. Back at her apartment, Avery dropped her bag and collapsed into a chair. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, breathing hard. A warm drop fell onto the back of her hand. She didn't know whether it was a tear or sweat. "It's okay," she whispered, as if speaking to her child. "Mom's not going back." But sometimes not going back hurt like a fresh tear, because it forced her to face everything she had endured. The next day was her appointment. Avery walked into the clinic wearing calm like a borrowed coat. But the body doesn't lie. Her shoulders were tight. Her eyes were sleep-deprived. Her breathing was shallow. Mateo Rivera took one look at her and knew. He closed the exam room door gently. He didn't rush to ask for numbers or reach for his tablet. He simply looked at her, directly, the way someone does when they can see the storm behind a smile. "What happened?" Mateo asked, his voice low and steady, like a chair she could finally sit down in. And Avery, who had planned to say, "I'm fine," suddenly felt her throat close on the very first word. Chapter 6. Approximately 1,050 to 1,150 words. Not a patient. "What happened?" Mateo's question didn't sound like the ones Avery had heard in clinics before. Questions that always began with numbers. Blood pressure, weight, medical history. This question went straight to the human part of her, and for that reason, it unsettled Avery more than any legal clause ever had. She sat on the edge of the exam table, her hands clasped together. By instinct, by survival, she had almost said nothing. But Mateo's brown eyes stayed where they were. No pressure, no probing, just steady, like a place that was safe. Avery exhaled, her voice rougher than she intended. "She came looking for me." Mateo didn't ask who. He understood immediately, but he still let Avery have the right to tell it in her own way. "Sloane," Avery said, and the name carried with it the cold scent of perfume and the memory of being backed against a wall. "She said I trapped Damien with the pregnancy." Mateo nodded slowly. No surprise, no judgment. Only the faintest shadow crossed his face, like someone hearing a word that was too filthy to be used on something that should have been clean. "Are you okay?" he asked. Avery gave a dry smile and looked down at her hands. "I was, until she said it. It's strange." She swallowed. "I thought I'd already left that world behind." Mateo sat down in the chair across from her, keeping just enough distance. His voice was gentle but firm. "You did leave them," he said, "but wounds don't leave as quickly." Avery felt her throat tighten. Part of her wanted to stiffen, to prove she wasn't weak. But another part, tired, just wanted permission to soften. Just once. Mateo watched her for another beat, then said something very simple. "Today we prioritize you. Not the pregnancy, not your health in a cold clinical sense. You, Avery, a person." He quickly checked what needed to be checked, efficient and professional, then returned to a normal tone. "Miss Carter," he said, "I won't tell you, don't let it bother you, because I know that's useless. But you need one thing, a place where you aren't judged by your past." Avery looked at him. "I can take care of myself." "I believe that," Mateo replied immediately. "But taking care of yourself doesn't mean carrying everything alone." The air between them paused on that sentence, like something unlocking. Avery stood up, picked up her bag, ready to end the appointment the way she always did. She didn't want to extend a personal conversation here. She didn't want to confuse herself. He was a doctor. She was a patient. Clear boundaries. She took 2 steps before Mateo called softly, "Avery." She stopped. It was the first time he'd said her name without miss. Mateo frowned slightly as if weighing what he was about to say. Not hesitation, but respect. "I know this may be inappropriate," he said carefully, "and you can say no immediately. But," he took a small breath, then met her eyes, "would you like to have dinner with me?" Not as my patient. The world inside Avery's head went suddenly silent, like someone had cut the sound. She had prepared herself for many things: legal paperwork, Damien's pressure, Sloane's cruelty. But she hadn't prepared for a man looking at her as a woman, someone deserving of kindness, at a moment when she was pregnant and newly divorced. Avery gave a very small smile, half self-mocking, half defensive. "You're asking me to dinner when I'm—" She didn't finish the sentence, only touched her belly lightly, like a period at the end. Mateo didn't smile, didn't play the hero. "I'm not asking out of pity," he said. "I'm asking because I enjoy talking to you, and I think you deserve a normal evening." A normal evening? Those words made Avery want to cry, because for her, normal had become a luxury. Not being interrogated, not being measured, not being weighed and assessed. Just eating a meal, breathing, being human. But the fear was still there, like a guard dog at the door. She heard Damien's voice in her head. "Who would want you?" She heard Sloane. "You trapped him." She heard her old self. "Don't trust." Avery looked at Mateo for a long time, searching his eyes for something familiar from Damien. Possession, pity, the urge to save her. There was none, only sincerity and a kind of patience that didn't force itself. "Just one dinner," Avery said finally, her voice low. "I won't promise anything more." Mateo nodded at once, as if that was exactly the answer he'd hoped for, and respected every word of it. "Just one." The Italian restaurant Mateo chose wasn't in a glamorous district. It was small, with warm yellow light, wooden tables, and background music as thin as breath. The server greeted Mateo by name, like a regular. Mateo pulled out Avery's chair. No show, no performance. They ordered pasta, sparkling water, and a salad. Avery realized she was eating, and that it tasted good, a simple thing she hadn't had in a long time, because meals with Damien had always been events, performances played to assigned roles. Mateo talked about his work, about choosing obstetrics because that's where hope lives. He didn't speak to impress, he spoke like someone sharing. Avery spoke less, but then, without knowing why, she said something she had stored away for 5 years. "I used to draw." Mateo looked up. "Draw what?" "Anything," Avery replied, smiling faintly. "Trees, people, color. I like color." Mateo paused. "Why did you stop?" Avery turned her fork slowly. Damien said it was pointless. It was a hobby for people with nothing to do, that his wife shouldn't get paint on her hands. Mateo looked at her. This time his eyes darkened, not with loud anger, but with a deep, quiet refusal. "He doesn't get to define your value," Mateo said. Avery wanted to laugh, but nothing came out, only a heat rising in her chest. After dinner, Mateo didn't take her to a bar or pull her into a loud romantic date. He took her to an art supply store. Avery stood in front of the watercolor shelf, her fingers touching a paint set like she was touching a former life. She heard herself whisper, "I'm not sure I can still draw." Mateo answered simply, "Then try." He picked out a few basics: paper, pencils, a small paint set, not the most expensive, not to buy her, but to build a bridge back toward her. The next day he took her to the botanical garden. Sunlight filtered through the greenhouse glass in green streaks. Avery sat on a bench, opened the sketchbook, and looked at a flower just beginning to bloom. Her hand trembled at first. Then the line appeared. Not beautiful, not perfect, but real. Mateo stood beside her, not looking at the page like a judge. He looked at Avery as if watching something return from the dead. "See," he said softly, "you're still here." Avery bit her lip. A tear fell onto the page. She wiped it away quickly, but the water spread, leaving a mark, proof that she could still feel. And for the first time in a very long while, Avery felt seen, not as a divorced wife, not as the mother of a child, but as Avery. That evening, Mateo drove her home. The small apartment glowed warmly. The courtyard was quiet. A light breeze stirred. Mateo stopped the car. They sat in silence for a moment, as if neither wanted to break the gentleness wrapping around them. He walked her up to the door, didn't step inside, stopped exactly at the boundary. Avery reached for her keys, her hand slower than usual. Mateo said softly, "Avery." She turned. Mateo looked at her like a man trying to do the kindest thing in a situation that could easily be misunderstood. He spoke slowly, carefully, placing each word down so he wouldn't frighten her. Avery, I want to do everything right, but I genuinely like you. Not trust me, not let me take care of you. Just a truth, spoken cleanly, without conditions. Avery stood still, her heart pounding. In that quiet hallway, she heard both past and future at once. On one side, Damien's voice calling her broken, and on the other, a man standing at her door, asking permission, with respect. The next morning, Avery woke to the faint sound of something sliding softly outside the door, a noise too quiet to be called loud, but strange enough to pull her out of her shallow sleep. She got up, walked over, and opened the door a crack. A white envelope lay right at the threshold, thick, squared at the corners. Stamped with the seal of the court in the name of a law firm, Avery recognized immediately. The firm Damien had always used to package deals like steel containers. Avery stood there for a few seconds, as if not touching it might make it disappear. It didn't. She bent down and picked it up. The paper was cold, heavy, like a stone. In the kitchen, morning light fell across the old wooden table. Avery set the envelope down and tore it open. Her hands trembled slightly despite her effort to steady them. The papers slid out like blades. Petition for joint custody. Request that the child carry the Kensington surname. Request for a restraining order. Avery's vision darkened as she reached that line. A cold surge ran straight down her spine, fast and merciless. So he really did it. Damien hadn't come to apologize. Damien had come to reclaim control, using the only weapons he truly mastered, money and the law. Avery pressed a hand to her belly, breathing fast. The baby kicked lightly, reacting to her racing heartbeat. Avery closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself back into the present. But in her mind, Damien was already there, standing in a conference room, gray eyes cold, saying calmly, "I will take the child." Avery had thought it was an angry threat. It turned out to be a plan. Her phone vibrated. A message from Helena arrived at precisely the right moment, as if she had sensed the storm. "Have you received it?" Avery replied, short and broken. "Yes. I'm scared." Less than a minute later, Helena called. Her voice was direct, giving Avery no room to sink. "Listen to me. Don't panic. Damien is using the petition to throw you off balance. The more you panic, the more he wins." Avery swallowed. What if he wins? The question escaped before she could stop it. It wasn't a legal question. It was the cry of a mother. Helena paused just long enough for Avery to hear her own heartbeat. Then she said, firm as a nail driven in, "He won't win if you do this right. And you will do this right. Because I'm here." Avery leaned back against the kitchen cabinet, her legs suddenly weak. Helena continued, shifting into strategy mode. Step 1, communication boundaries. From now on, you do not respond to any calls or messages from Damien. Everything goes through me. He'll try to provoke you into saying something wrong that he can use in court. Avery nodded even though Helena couldn't see her. Step 2, we prepare evidence of stability. Helena listed, like reading an inventory. Lease agreement, prenatal appointments, prenatal yoga class, freelance income, bank accounts, health insurance, post-birth plan. Avery listened, clinging to the bullet points like a handrail. Step 3, Helena lowered her voice. Evidence of emotional abuse. Avery went rigid. Helena didn't soften it. What he said to you, broken, useless, threats to take the child, that's a pattern of control. Do you have texts, emails, notes, witnesses? Avery remembered the silent nights after his verbal attacks, the words Damien hurled at her, and then walked away as if nothing had happened. She hadn't saved them. She had deleted them, because she was afraid to see them. I don't know, Avery breathed. That's okay, Helena cut in calmly. We'll reconstruct it. You write down everything you remember. Dates, contexts, exact words. Do you have journals, medical appointments? Anyone who saw you fall apart? Any doctors who noted stress? Avery closed her eyes. Yes. Good, Helena said. Do not try to be the nice one in this fight. Being nice to Damien is cruel to you and your child. Avery felt her throat tighten. I just want peace. Peace is coming, Helena replied. But first you have to stand firm. The call ended. Avery set the phone down and stared at the envelope on the table like a sleeping animal. She knew it would bite if she turned her back. The window suddenly rattled. Wind. A normal sound. But Avery flinched. She hated this feeling, always having to stay on guard. Her phone vibrated again. This time a message from an unknown number. Avery, we need to talk. Don't let lawyers ruin everything. Damien. Avery stared at the words, her heart pounding. Her finger hovered over the screen. One tap and she could reply. Just one sentence, one explanation, one insult. But Helena was right. He wanted her off balance. Avery deleted the message, blocked the number. Her hands shook, but her action was decisive. The moment she finished, tears spilled over, not from weakness, but from the feeling of cutting the last binding cord. She sat down in a chair, both hands wrapped around her belly, breathing. And then she heard a knock at the door. Not urgent, not insistent. Avery startled, quickly wiping her tears. Her eyes went to the camera screen. Mateo stood in the hallway. He was outside, wearing a light jacket, holding a paper bag. Avery opened the door slightly. What are you doing here? Mateo looked at her, and in that single glance he knew. Not the specific details of the petition, but that she was breaking. I was nearby, he said gently, and I felt like you weren't okay. May I come in? Avery hesitated. Boundaries, risk. But Mateo's eyes didn't push. They were simply a place she could lean. She opened the door wider. Mateo stepped in and set the paper bag on the table. Hot soup, soft bread, a few oranges. A kind of care that didn't make you feel indebted. Avery let out a dry laugh. I got served. Mateo didn't ask for details right away. He pulled a chair close, not touching, just near. Damien, he asked. Avery nodded, tears rising again. He's asking for custody. He wants the baby to have his last name. He's using money to force it. Mateo exhaled, his jaw tightening. A flicker of anger crossed his face, but he restrained it. He didn't turn his anger into pressure on Avery. Avery clutched her sleeve. What if he wins? What if he takes my child? Her voice broke on the word child. Mateo leaned in and finally placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a steady, warm touch like an anchor. Listen to me, he said, his voice low. He does not get to destroy your life anymore. Avery shook her head, as if she couldn't believe the law could beat money. Mateo looked straight into her eyes. You're not alone. You have Helena, you have evidence, and you have me, if you allow it. Avery's breathing quickened. She hated needing anyone, but she also understood strength wasn't carrying everything alone. Mateo pulled her into his arms, not tight, just enough for her to feel someone standing beside her. Avery rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Steady, calm. She cried, the first time she allowed herself to cry without fearing she'd be seen as weak. After a long while, Mateo gently lifted her chin. His eyes weren't dramatic, not saving, just real. He said clearly, like a decision, I love you. Avery stood still, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't answer. She didn't have to yet. In that moment, I love you wasn't a confession demanding a response. It was a promise to stand on her side, right in the middle of a battle Damien had dragged to her door. Avery didn't respond to, I love you. She couldn't. Not because she wasn't moved, but because in that exact moment, a part of her, the part that had lived too long under Damien's shadow, raised a tired guard's hand and said, careful, don't make the same mistake again. She sat on the sofa, legs tucked in, one hand resting on her belly. Mateo sat across from her, a warm mug of tea in his hands as if he were trying to keep the atmosphere as ordinary as possible. Outside, rain fell lightly. On the glass, thin streaks of water stretched downward, like sentences left unfinished. Avery inhaled, her voice as thin as a thread pulled through fabric. I'm afraid I'll trust the wrong person again. Mateo didn't rush to argue. He didn't say I'm different. He didn't say you have to trust me. He simply nodded, like someone who understood that fear well enough not to explain it away. I know, he said slowly, And I don't want you jumping into anything just to prove you're okay. Avery looked at him, eyes red. I don't want to be pulled into another cage. Mateo set his mug down, his back straightened, his voice clear, as if drawing a line Avery could hold on to. I'll be here, he said, but you decide the pace. You decide the distance. You decide when to say stop. Avery felt her chest loosen, just a little, but enough to breathe. Mateo studied her for another beat, then added as if reminding her of the most important thing this week. And this week, your priority isn't feelings. Your priority is safety. Avery nodded, tears slipping down to her chin. She wiped them quickly. Helena said he'll try to provoke me. He wants me to slip up. Then don't talk to him, Mateo said immediately. Say no with actions. Avery let out a dry laugh. Saying no to Damien, I used to shake just thinking about it. Mateo leaned in slightly, his gaze steady. Then we practice. In the days that followed, Avery lived as if she were learning a new language, the language of boundaries. Her phone was quieter now that Helena had blocked the main channels of contact, but Damien still tried to slip through. Emails, unknown numbers, even letters sent for the child. Each time, Avery did only one thing. She took screenshots, forwarded them to Helena, then set the phone down. No arguments, no explanations, no pleading. This time, no was no longer a trembling sound. It became a habit. Some days, Avery stood in front of the mirror and said it out loud, as if rehearsing for court. No. 2 syllables that made her throat burn, but left her spine straighter. Mateo didn't make her lean on him in order to be strong. He did something harder. He helped her remember that the strength was hers. He walked slowly with her around the shared courtyard, talking about very ordinary things. The tree losing its leaves, Mrs. Elaine's dog, a new soup recipe. Everything was small, but everything was real. And in those small, real moments, Avery grew less afraid. Then the day of the temporary hearing arrived. The courthouse wasn't like the movies Avery had seen. There was no dramatic gavel slam, just a cold room that smelled of paper and disinfectant. Hard wooden benches that made your back ache, and white overhead lights that made everyone look pale. Damien walked in like he was entering a boardroom. Tailored suit, rigid gaze, 2 attorneys flanking him. He looked at Avery as if to say, "You still belong to my world." Avery placed a hand on her belly. A small kick answered, like a reminder. "Stand firm, Mom." Helena stood beside her, opened her file, and spoke in a calm but sharp voice. She laid everything out clearly. Avery's housing, income, medical appointments, preparation for the baby, and stability. She spoke of communication boundaries, of threatening and coercive messages, of Damien using litigation as a tool of control. Damien's lawyer tried to pivot, to the child needing the father's name, to the mother being influenced by another man. But the judge wasn't seduced by phrasing. They looked at Damien and asked directly, their voice not loud but heavy enough. "Mr. Kensington, have you ever threatened to take the child using your power and money?" Damien's jaw tightened. "I only want to protect my rights as a father." The judge didn't nod, only responded cold and precise. Parental rights do not equal control over the child's mother, and the court prioritizes the stability and safety of the mother during pregnancy. That sentence alone was enough to make Avery's knees go weak, this time from relief. A temporary decision was issued. Medical and prenatal care authority remained with Avery. Visitation schedules, paperwork, and the child's surname would be reviewed after birth. Damien was formally instructed that all communication must go through attorneys, with no harassment or pressure. Damien left the courtroom like a man whose microphone had been cut. His face was flushed. He hissed something to his lawyers, then turned sharply toward Avery in the hallway. "You think you've won?" he snarled. Avery looked at him. Her heart was still racing, but her hands no longer shook. "I just want peace," she said. "If you want to be a father, start by respecting your child's mother." Damien looked as if she'd struck his pride directly. His eyes darkened. Then suddenly, his tone shifted, fast as a mask being changed. "Avery!" He lowered his voice, almost pleading. "I was wrong. I went too far." An apology that came too late. an apology that smelled of fear of loss. Avery didn't respond. She turned away. Because she understood now, apologies don't turn time back. Apologies don't restore the dignity that was ground into the floor. On the drive back, Helena glanced at Avery in the rearview mirror. "You did well," she said. Avery exhaled as she just crossed a suspension bridge. Her phone vibrated. A message from Helena followed immediately, short and practical, as always. "We won for now, but he'll try again." Avery looked at the screen, then out the car window, the city sliding past, yellow lights stretching across wet pavement. And she placed a hand on her belly and felt a gentle movement. "Yeah," Avery whispered, this time not in fear, "but so will Mom." 2 a.m. The entire building slept beneath a silence thin as paper, but beyond the window, the sky was screaming. Rain slammed against the glass in waves. Wind yanked at the power lines until they shrieked. And every time lightning split the sky, the room flashed white, as if someone were taking photographs. Avery jolted upright in bed as pain tore from her lower back down into her belly. Nothing like the vague tightening she'd felt in recent days. This pain had rhythm, intention. It carried a clear message. It's time. She stood in the middle of the room, one hand clutching her belly, the other bracing against the chair. Her breathing went shallow. Cold sweat beaded along the back of her neck. In the darkness, she heard Mateo stir on the couch in the living room. He'd been sleeping there for weeks now, an unspoken agreement between them. He stayed close so that if Avery needed him in the night, she wouldn't be alone. Avery called softly, her voice breaking with pain and fear. "Mateo, it's starting." Mateo was on his feet instantly, as if his body had already been awake. No panic, no unnecessary questions. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning quickly, her color, her posture, her breathing. "Look at me," Mateo said, his voice low and steady. "Breathe with me. In. Hold. Out." Avery clung to his voice like a handrail. The contraction passed. She trembled. Mateo had already grabbed his phone, called the hospital, and delivered the information in short, precise sentences. Then he turned back and picked up the bag prepared in the corner of the apartment. Documents, baby items, towels, chargers, and a soft outfit Avery liked. "Okay," he said, "we're going." Avery glanced toward the window. Rain pouring down, wind flattening the maple tree in the courtyard. "The weather," she breathed. "It's bad." Mateo put a raincoat on her first, pulled the hood snug, then wrapped a thin scarf around her neck. He moved quickly, but not in a way that made her panic. He moved like someone who had practiced this 100 times. "You just breathe," he said, lowering himself so his eyes were level with hers. "I'll handle the rest." They descended the stairs. Each step felt like a negotiation with her body. Avery had to stop halfway as another contraction surged. Mateo steadied her, didn't pull, didn't lift her like she was fragile. He was simply there, exactly when needed. "One more," he said. "You're doing great." Rain lashed her face the moment the building door opened. Mateo held an umbrella, but the wind tore at it, threatening to flip it inside out. He adjusted instantly, pulled Avery close, shielded her with his body, and opened the car door. As Avery settled into the seat, another wave of pain crashed down. "Mateo!" she groaned, gripping the seatbelt. Mateo started the engine, turned on the hazard lights, his voice never rising. "Look at me. In. Out. You're safe." The car surged into the rain-soaked streets. Water pooled beneath the streetlights, stretching into long, golden reflections. Each swipe of the windshield wipers erased the world and brought it back. Erase, return. Just like the contractions overtaking her body. Mateo drove steadily. He kept talking, not to fill silence, but to anchor Avery to the present. The pain comes. You breathe. It goes. It doesn't stay forever. "Do you hear me?" Avery nodded, tears spilling over. She didn't know whether from pain or from the fear that she wasn't strong enough. "I hear you," she whispered. "Good," Mateo said. "You're doing exactly right." At an intersection, the car jolted over a flooded pothole. Avery gasped as her belly clenched hard. "I can't do this," she cried, her voice breaking. Mateo glanced at her briefly, then reached over and took her hand, never taking his eyes off the road. "You can," he said, "because you're not doing it alone." The hospital glowed white like a massive ship anchored in the storm. Avery was rushed into a delivery room. Machines beeped. Footsteps hurried past. Voices called out, "IV in," and "fetal heart rate is good." But through all of it, Avery heard only Mateo's voice. "Breathe. Look at me. One more time. You're doing so well." Labor lasted longer than Avery had imagined. Pain crashed over her in waves. At times, she felt as if she were separating from her own body, as though her soul wanted to flee. "I can't," Avery sobbed, her vision blurring. "I can't do this anymore." Mateo leaned in close, his forehead nearly touching hers. His brown eyes didn't waver. "You can," he said, slow and certain, as if hammering the words into the air. "Not because you have to prove anything to anyone, but because you're a mother, and your baby is coming." Thunder roared in the distance. Outside, the rain still raged. Inside, Avery gathered every remaining ounce of strength, not for Damien, not for anyone else, but for herself and the life standing at the edge of the world. And then a cry rang out, high, clear, furious with life just entering existence. The nurse placed the baby on Avery's chest. The baby's skin was warm, slick, and trembling slightly. Avery looked down, a small, scrunched face, thin dark hair plastered to the scalp, tiny hands clenching and releasing. Avery's breath caught. Tears poured freely. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, Oliver." Mateo stood beside her, his eyes red. He reached out and gently touched the baby's forehead, a gesture of reverence. "Oliver James Carter," he said softly, as if naming were a sacred ritual. "You're beautiful." Avery turned her face and pressed her lips to her son's forehead. She felt something extraordinary. The storm outside still raged, but inside her chest a quiet sky had opened. The second day in the hospital passed in the scent of milk, the hum of monitors and fractured sleep. Avery held Oliver in her arms, her hospital gown loose, her hair a mess, but her face was calmer than it had been on the day she signed the divorce papers. Mateo sat beside the bed with a cup of cold coffee, his eyes never leaving mother and child, as if they were a real miracle. Then the door swung open. Avery startled and looked up. Damien Kensington stood there, holding a large bouquet of flowers and an oversized teddy bear, as if gifts could repair every word that had shattered her. His gaze landed on Oliver, then shifted to Mateo, and the room dropped several degrees colder, even though the heater was still running. Damien stood at the doorway, like a man who had stepped into a room that no longer belonged to him. The bouquet in his hands was too large, the teddy bear too new, everything reeking of the easiest kind of redemption money could buy. But what made the air in the room sag wasn't the flowers. It was the way Damien's gaze locked onto the man sitting beside the bed. Mateo, a simple shirt, hair slightly mussed from sleeping upright, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. He looked at Damien without challenge and without retreat, calm, like someone who had chosen his place and was standing still inside it. Damien's jaw tightened. His voice snapped out, sharp and openly possessive. "What is he doing here?" Avery was holding Oliver against her chest. The baby slept, lips pursed, breath thin as thread. Avery adjusted the blanket over him before lifting her eyes. She looked exhausted, but the old fear was gone from them. "He's here because I want him here," Avery said clearly. Damien blinked, as if unaccustomed to hearing that from her. Avery had once asked his permission for everything, even for the right to be sad. Now she spoke like she was setting rules. "This is a hospital," Damien growled, trying to reclaim authority through language. "Not your house." Avery met his gaze. "All the more reason. You don't get to give orders here." Damien stepped closer. The bouquet brushed the doorframe, leaves rustling with an unpleasant sound. "I came to see my child," he said, forcing his voice low. "I have that right." Mateo stood up, but he didn't move forward. He simply straightened, his voice calm, like a second door behind the first. "You can see the baby," Mateo said, "if you behave appropriately." Damien spun toward him, gray eyes flashing. "I don't need your permission." Mateo didn't move. Correct. You need Avery's. In that moment, Avery realized something that made her chest tighten. Mateo wasn't taking her voice from her. He was giving it back. Avery looked at Damien. If you want to see Oliver, put the flowers down. Put the bear down, and put that tone down. Damien froze. He was used to walking into boardrooms and having the room fall silent. Now a woman in a hospital bed, hair messy, gown loose, was controlling the air. He swallowed. Then, as if he finally understood that touching the baby required setting his ego down first, Damien complied. He placed the teddy bear on a chair near the door. Set the flowers on the table by the window. The expensive gift sat there, suddenly useless and slightly absurd in a room filled with the smell of milk. Avery nodded once. Sit! Damien pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat, his back too straight. His eyes never left Oliver. Avery, he whispered as if afraid to wake the baby. I want to hold him. Avery studied him for a few seconds. Somewhere inside her, the scars were still there. But her child, this baby, had the right to a biological father, if that man was willing to learn how to be human. All right, Avery said, but listen carefully. Damien nodded stiffly. You wash your hands, Avery pointed to the sink. Then you sit here. And if you say anything like, I'll take him, I call the nurse immediately. Damien said nothing. He stood and washed his hands. Water ran, soap foamed. Everything looked strangely ordinary, like life was forcing a billionaire to relearn the basics. When Damien returned, Avery carefully lifted Oliver and placed him into his arms. Damien reached out, hands that had signed million-dollar contracts now trembling slightly, like someone learning to hold something fragile for the first time. He lifted Oliver awkwardly but with effort. His whole body went taut. Oliver frowned, mouth twitching, then settled back into steady breathing. Damien looked down at him, and his face cracked. Not the crack of anger, the crack of long frozen ice touched by sunlight. The gray eyes that had once been cold suddenly filled with moisture. He stared at the tiny nose, the small mouth, the faint curl of fingers. My God, Damien whispered, his voice breaking. My son. Avery watched, her feelings too complex to name. She didn't soften toward Damien as a man, but she did see something real. Love for his child. Damien lifted his eyes to Avery, red-rimmed. I'm sorry. The word sorry fell from his mouth like something he had never learned how to use properly. I'm sorry for what I said, Damien swallowed hard, for calling you those things, for making you believe you weren't enough. Avery listened. Her heart didn't leap with hope. It simply settled, like a late acknowledgement of something she had known all along. She nodded, her voice even. I accept your apology. Damien exhaled as if he'd just been spared, but Avery continued, clear and final. I'm not coming back. The flicker of hope in Damien's eyes went out instantly. He looked at Oliver, then at Avery, as if he couldn't understand why sorry didn't buy the pass back. Mateo stood quietly in the corner, not intruding, but his presence was like a steady breath filling the room. Damien lowered his voice, clinging to the last thing he could. The lawsuit. Avery didn't answer. She waited. Damien's jaw tightened. I'll withdraw it, for now. He looked at Avery, almost pleading. We'll arrange visitation. By the book. Helena had warned Avery not to negotiate directly, but Avery also understood. A step back from Damien now could mean precious peace for Oliver. Helena will work with your attorney, Avery said. Clear visitation. Clear rules. Damien nodded, his eyes still fixed on Oliver. I just want to be in my son's life. Avery looked at him, and this time her voice wasn't soft or hard, just true. Then learn how to be there without destroying everything. A while later, Damien handed Oliver back to Avery. He studied the baby as if trying to memorize every feature. He picked up the bouquet and set it neatly in place, as if in a ritual. At the door, he paused, turned back and looked at Avery for a long moment. I'll prove I can be a father, Damien said, his voice low, more serious than before. Avery didn't smile. She didn't encourage him. She simply pulled Oliver closer and met Damien's eyes. Prove it with actions. Damien stood still for a second, as if the words had pinned him in place. Then he nodded, turned, and closed the door. As the door shut, the room seemed to exhale. Avery looked down at Oliver and kissed his forehead. Mateo stepped closer, his voice very soft. "You did really well." Avery didn't answer right away. She looked at the door, then turned to Mateo, who was still standing exactly where he should be, not taking space, not forcing anything. Just staying. And in her chest, a thought flashed like lightning after a storm. Maybe Father isn't the only man who shares DNA. Maybe Father is the one who chooses to stay, in the right way. Oliver slept in Mateo's arms as if that were where he had always belonged. Only one small yellow lamp was on in the living room, its light spilling onto the old wooden floor in a warm strip. Outside the window, the city was quiet, a rare kind of quiet after months of storms. Avery stood at the bedroom doorway, not stepping in, just watching. Mateo held Oliver tilted against his chest, one hand supporting the baby's neck, the other patting gently in rhythm. He sang very softly, no recognizable song, just low, instinctive hums like an improvised lullaby. Oliver frowned, then relaxed. Each time Mateo exhaled, the baby seemed to breathe with him. Avery felt her heart soften, not the kind of softness that makes you lose yourself, but the kind that comes when a wound is finally touched by clean hands. Mateo looked up and caught her gaze. He didn't smile broadly or act like he was earning points. He just gave a very small wink, as if to say, "Go get some sleep. I've got this." Avery stepped closer and draped a thin blanket over Mateo's shoulders. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to, because the most beautiful things aren't made of words. They're made of steady acts, repeated every day. Time passed through moments too small to turn into stories. Yet those moments were the story. At 2 in the morning, Avery woke to Oliver's soft fussing. Mateo was already awake, quietly changing a diaper under the nightlight, hands quick but gentle, never startling Oliver into crying. Meals are going cold because the baby drifted off during the feed. Avery was standing under the shower, hearing Mateo in the other room talking to Oliver like he was already grown. "Listen here, little man. Your mom fought like hell to bring you into this world." Avery had once believed love had to be loud to be real. Mateo loved being there, by doing the things no one applauded, by never making her feel grateful to the point of indebtedness. At Oliver's first pediatric appointments, Mateo came along. He never stepped into the role of father. He carried the bag, asked the doctor a few questions, then turned to Avery and said, "What do you want to decide?" For the first time, Avery felt her motherhood fully respected, not taken from her, not redirected, not overridden. The day Oliver smiled for the first time wasn't staged or monumental. It happened while Avery was fumbling with a bib, and Mateo was making ridiculous faces like a child, scrunching his nose, puffing his cheeks, making a stupid boop sound. Oliver burst into giggles, mouth open, eyes crinkled. Avery froze for a few seconds. Then tears rolled down her face, silent and hot. Mateo looked at her, his own eyes wet. He didn't say, "Don't cry." He just wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We did it," he whispered. Avery looked at Oliver, and for the first time, she believed doing it didn't just mean surviving. It meant living in a way that was worth living. Damien flowed into that time as well, but this time by schedule. He came every other weekend, on time. No sudden appearances, no looming in the lobby like a threat. He knocked, waited for Avery to open the door, and greeted Mateo with a brief nod. Not friendly, but not hostile. Damien held Oliver more awkwardly than Mateo, always tense, as if afraid he might hurt him. But he learned. He asked questions. He listened. He began bringing things not to buy Avery's favor, but to understand his son. A crinkly fabric book, a small plush toy sized for a baby's hands, a tiny knitted hat. He never brought Sloane. Avery didn't ask. She simply noted the change the way one notes the weather. The wind isn't as violent today, but Damien's world didn't settle just because of Oliver. One afternoon, Helena called Avery, brief as always. "Sloane caused trouble. She's burning her own bridges." Avery was quiet. Her old instinct, to ask what happened, rose, then faded. She no longer carried that kind of painful curiosity. "Still," Helena continued, as if updating Avery so she wouldn't be blindsided. Sloane wanted to get pregnant to secure Damien, Helena said. She tried for months. It didn't work. And she's angry at everyone. Avery didn't know what she felt. Part of her felt sadness for a woman who turned her life into a competition. Another part felt only distance. A few days later, the truth arrived on its own. Damien came to see Oliver, but that day he looked tired. His tie was looser, dark circles under his eyes. He held Oliver for a while, sitting silently, as if another battle was still raging in his head. Avery didn't ask. Neither did Mateo. Until Damien spoke, his voice hoarse like the words hadn't meant to escape. Sloane left. Avery looked up, not because she cared about Sloane, but because the sentence landed like a stone dropped into water. Something had cracked. Damien looked at Oliver, his finger brushing the baby's tiny hand. She gave me an ultimatum, he said, letting out a dry laugh. Either me or the baby. Avery stayed still. Mateo did too. Damien swallowed as if admitting something out loud for the first time was an act of shame. I used to think love was choosing the most beautiful option, the most suitable, the least complicated. Something like a trophy. He said the word trophy like it tasted metallic. Then he looked at Avery, his eyes no longer arrogant, only tired, too late. It's empty, he said. Avery didn't respond. She didn't need revenge in words. Life had delivered it for her. Damien stood and handed Oliver back to Avery. Before leaving, he spoke very softly, almost to himself. I want to do it right. This time. Avery looked at him, her voice calm. Then just do it right. You don't need to say it. Damien nodded, and for the first time he left without carrying the sense that he had won or lost, only a lesson. Mateo never said, I'll replace Damien. He never stood in front of Oliver and called himself Dad without Avery naming it first. He simply built his presence the way someone builds a house, brick by brick, day after day. When Oliver had a fever, Mateo stayed up all night with Avery, changing cool cloths, logging medication times, and calling the pediatrician. When Avery was exhausted, Mateo set a bowl of hot soup in front of her and said, Eat, then sleep. I've got him. Not an order. Care that didn't require permission. Avery slowly understood. Real love doesn't take away her freedom. Real love lifts it. One evening, Oliver fell asleep early. The small apartment was quiet, like a warm box. Avery was folding baby clothes when Mateo called her into the living room. He stood beside the table, the yellow light stretching his shadow across the floor. In his hand was a small velvet box. Avery froze. Her heart raced, not because of marriage or rings, but because of an old fear, that something beautiful might come with a cost. Mateo looked at her calm. He didn't kneel right away. He didn't create a scene. He simply said, his voice low and honest, Avery, I don't want to be someone who just passes through your life. He held the velvet box out to her the way someone offers a choice, not a trap. And in that moment, Avery realized what made her tremble wasn't the ring. It was the larger question opening in front of her. Was she brave enough to trust someone who chose to stay? Oliver blew out the candles with solemn concentration, lips pursed, cheeks puffed like a little squirrel, attempting an important task. The candles on the chocolate cake flickered, flames dancing in the afternoon breeze and in the laughter of children running around the backyard. His 5th birthday. The yard wasn't large, but it was full. Balloons, string lights draped along the wooden fence, a table covered with a checkered cloth, colorful paper cups. Avery set down a plate of cake and turned just in time to see Mateo standing behind Oliver, one hand lightly steadying the boy's shoulder so he wouldn't, out of sheer excitement, dive face first into the cake. Easy there, buddy, Mateo teased. Blow, not eat it with your nose. Oliver giggled, then blew hard. The candles went out. Cheers erupted across the yard. Avery stood nearby, holding a small baby girl in her arms, hair soft as silk, brown eyes like Avery's, tilting her head back in laughter until her eyes curved into crescents. The baby slapped the air as if trying to join the cheering, and Avery kissed her forehead, the sense of milk and sunlight blending together. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the low fence, a man stood still. Damien. He didn't step in right away. He stood there like a guest who had arrived early, or like someone still unaccustomed to no longer being the center of the picture. His shirt was buttoned to the collar, but the sharp, icy edge he once carried was gone. Time had worn down his corners, not turning him into someone else, just making him less indifferent. Damien watched Oliver, the child who had once been a weapon in his battles, now laughing, running, living in a yard full of voices. And Damien watched Matteo, wiping cake crumbs from the corner of Oliver's mouth with a paper napkin, the motion as natural as breathing. Avery caught Damien's gaze from a distance. She didn't flinch. She didn't tense. She simply nodded, a small nod shaped by years of hard-earned calm. Damien opened the gate and stepped inside. Oliver spotted him and shouted, "Dad!" then ran over, feet moving so fast he nearly tripped. Matteo and Avery exchanged a familiar look, the look of two people who had learned how to stand on the same side. Damien bent down and hugged Oliver. The hug was a little awkward, but real. "Happy birthday, son," he said, his voice faintly hoarse. "Dad brought you a gift." Oliver pulled Damien farther into the yard, as if pulling an entire part of his life with him, as if no war had ever existed. Watching them, Avery realized something. Oliver didn't need Damien because Damien deserved him. Oliver needed Damien because Oliver deserved a childhood without having to choose sides. Avery and Matteo's wedding was small and warm, exactly as she wanted. No press, no stage, just a garden, a handful of loved ones, a few laughs, and a simple dress that made Avery look like herself. Not someone's wife, not someone's spouse. Matteo's vows were short, unadorned. "I won't take your hand to pull you forward," he said. "I'll take your hand to walk beside you." Avery cried then, not from romance, but from the peace of a promise that didn't demand surrender. And then there was another day, also quiet, at the courthouse. Matteo legally adopted Oliver, not to take him from anyone, but to make the paperwork reflect what Oliver lived every day. This man was the one who changed diapers, soothed fevers, drove him to school, tied his shoes, and stood beside him through nightmares. Damien signed the consent. He did it after a long silence, not because it didn't hurt, but because he had grown enough to understand that fatherhood didn't live on paper. It lived in presence. After that, Damien remained Oliver's biological father. The visitation schedule stayed clear. The meetings remained regular. But instead of fighting, they coordinated. Exactly as Avery had demanded from the start. Prove it with actions. Avery's family filled with laughter in a way she had never imagined. Oliver grew up surrounded by two kinds of love: a biological father who had relearned how to be a father, and an everyday father who didn't need a title to stay. The little girl, Sophie, ran across the yard, hair flying, shouting, "Mom!" like she was calling the sun. Sometimes Avery stood at the kitchen doorway, watching them, and felt something strange. The past was still there, like a scar, but the scar no longer hurt. It simply reminded her that she had lived through it. That afternoon, while the children were absorbed in play, Damien approached Matteo, who was standing by the drinks table. There was no old tension, no competitive glances, just the quiet space between two grown men. Damien spoke first, his voice low. "Thank you." Matteo looked at him, waiting. Damien swallowed, forcing himself past the remnants of his old ego. "Thank you for giving Oliver a real family." Matteo nodded slightly. No triumph, no false modesty. "Oliver has a family because Avery chose it," Matteo said. "I just stayed." Damien looked toward the yard where Oliver was laughing, running, falling, and springing back up, as if pain were temporary. He let out a long breath, as if releasing something he'd held for 10 years. "Yeah," Damien said. "Avery chose right." Night fell. The string lights along the fence flickered on, small bulbs glowing like stars brought low. Avery stood on the porch holding a drowsy Sophie. Oliver leaned against her leg, clutching a toy car, his head tipping to the side. Matteo stepped up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. A familiar embrace, not possessive. "I'm just here." Avery looked out over her yard. Laughter, toys, the smell of cake, damp grass, a gentle wind. An ordinary life she once believed she didn't deserve. And she understood, deeply and clearly, like a final line that needed no embellishment. She was not saved by a man. She saved herself by leaving, by holding boundaries, by choosing kindness for herself. And because of that, love finally had a place to stay.